All right, so today we are diving into some really fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
We're talking about global politics, kind of a behind-the-scenes look at diplomacy.
Yeah, behind closed doors.
Exactly. And it all stems from this new book that you sent in the war by Bob Woodward.
Right.
And what's so interesting about this is...
Well, Bob Woodward, right. I mean,
Absolutely.
that name carries a lot of weight.
He's the real deal.
Yeah, he's not just some, political commentator.
Yeah.
This is the guy who broke Watergate.
Yeah, this is serious stuff. And so he's got this new book out, and it's basically about President Biden's take on some of these major world leaders.
Yeah.
And so we're talking Netanyahu, MBS, Putin,
Yeah.
some of the biggest names in global politics. And we get this really interesting look into Biden's personal opinions about them.
Right, and that's what makes this so fascinating, right? Because it's one thing to read the news and see, the official statements and the diplomatic niceties, but this is a glimpse behind the curtain, right?
Yeah, like what does he really think about these guys when he's
Exactly.
behind closed doors?
Yeah, when the cameras are off, what's really going on?
Exactly. So let's start with Netanyahu, because I think this is really revealing
Okay.
about how Biden sees the world and maybe how he approaches these relationships.
Sure.
So Woodward uses some pretty strong language to describe Biden's opinion of Netanyahu.
Yeah.
He basically calls him a liar
Wow.
and someone who's just really focused on staying in power,
Okay.
not necessarily on big picture strategy or anything like that.
And then that's a big deal, right? Because the U.S.-Israel relationship is so important.
Huge.
It's been a cornerstone of, U.S. foreign policy for decades.
For sure.
So for Biden to have such a negative view of Netanyahu,
Yeah.
it suggests that there's some real tension there behind the scenes.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder how much that personal dynamic
Right.
is really influencing the decisions that are being made.
Absolutely.
And it's not just words.
Yeah.
Like Woodward talks about this really intense phone call between Biden and Netanyahu about the situation in Gaza. And apparently Biden was just totally frustrated with Netanyahu, like accusing him of not really having a plan, not having a real strategy.
Wow.
And you can just kind of picture that conversation.
Yeah, you can feel the tension.
These two really strong personalities
Right.
butting heads.
And that anecdote, I think it speaks volumes about Biden's style, right?
How so?
Well, he seems to be someone who, even with allies, he's not afraid to be direct, even if it ruffles some feathers.
Yeah, no holds barred.
Right, exactly. But then it also makes you wonder, is that the most effective approach?
Yeah, is it all tough love or is it
Right.
creating more friction?
Exactly, and that's always the tightrope walk in diplomacy, right?
Sure.
You have to balance your own interests with the need to maintain relationships.
Totally. And that's where things get really interesting with how Biden sees Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia,
Okay.
MBS.
MBS, right?
So Woodward's book reveals that Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, called MBS a spoiled child.
Wow.
I mean-
That's pretty blunt,
That is not something you hear every day.
especially from the top U.S. diplomat.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And think about the context here.
Yeah,
Blinken was trying to negotiate humanitarian aid to Gaza.
right.
So to have this description of MBS come out,
Yeah.
it really shows you how tense
Right, how
fraught
fast.
those negotiations must have been.
Absolutely, and it really highlights the challenges the U.S. faces in the Middle East, right?
Yeah,
You have this need to work with Saudi Arabia,
they're a key ally.
right, for oil, for regional stability.
Right.
But at the same time, you have these concerns about human rights, about MBS's leadership.
And so it's this delicate dance
It is a delicate dance.
of trying to balance those interests.
Exactly.
And then on top of that, Woodward throws in this crazy detail.
Okay.
MBS had this stash of burner phones.
Burner phones.
Yeah, like 50 of them.
Wow.
Each one labeled with a name like Trump Sullivan.
Seriously?
Yeah, like what?
That's incredible.
Right.
What does that tell you?
It just screams paranoia to me. It does.
Like, what kind of conversations were happening on those phones?
What were they talking about that they needed this level of secrecy?
Yeah, and it makes you wonder how much of that was going on that we don't even know about.
Exactly. And that's what's so fascinating about this book, right? It gives you this peek behind the curtain into this world of power and influence.
It's like we're getting a glimpse into how the sausage is made.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not always pretty.
Right. And it really makes you think, like, what else is going on that we don't know about?
Absolutely. And that's what we're going to dive into next, right?
Yeah.
Because we haven't even gotten to Putin yet.
Oh, yeah. Things are about to get even more interesting.
Stay tuned.
So from burner phones and secret deals, let's move on to a leader who needs no introduction. Vladimir Putin.
Right. Buck one.
Yeah. This is where things get really interesting, especially given, everything that's going on in Ukraine right now.
Absolutely.
Because Woodward reveals that Biden did not hold back in his assessment of Putin at all.
Okay.
He straight up calls him evil.
Which, I mean...
That's not a word you throw around lightly.
No, not at all, especially when you're talking about another world leader.
Right. It's one thing to disagree on policy, but to call someone evil...
It speaks to a whole other level of animosity.
It does. And you have to wonder what was going through Biden's mind at the time.
Yeah, because we're talking about the period leading up to the invasion of Ukraine. Right?
Exactly. And that context is crucial because knowing what we know now, those words take on a whole new meaning.
Yeah, it's almost chilling looking back on it.
It is. And it makes you think about everything that's happened since.
Right. And this is where the book gets really unsettling.
Oh, so?
Because Woodward reveals that U.S. intelligence actually knew about Russia's plans to invade Ukraine months in advance.
Seriously? They knew?
Apparently so.
Wow, that's huge.
Right. It raises so many questions.
Like, what were they doing with that information?
Exactly. Were they trying to stop it? Did they do everything they could?
Were their hands tied?
Yeah. Was it a situation where saying something publicly would have made things worse?
It's a terrifying thought.
It is. And it makes you realize the weight of these decisions that these leaders are making.
Absolutely. They're dealing with life and death on a global scale.
And then just when you think it can't get any crazier, Woodward throws in this little detail.
Okay.
Even after Trump left office, he apparently had a phone call with Putin.
Wait, really? After he was out of office?
Yeah.
That's strange.
Right. Like, what were they talking about?
It just adds another layer of mystery to this whole thing.
It does, and it makes you wonder about the nature of their relationship.
Right. What did they talk about that they couldn't say publicly?
It's like every time we peel back a layer, there's just another layer underneath.
It's like a political onion.
Right. With all the tiers.
And just when you think you've got it figured out...
There's another twist.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes this book so compelling.
It really shows you the human side of these events.
It does, because behind all the policy and the strategy...
These are still just people.
Making decisions with imperfect information and their own personal biases.
And those decisions have huge consequences for all of us. It kind of makes you grateful for people like Bob Woodward, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, imagine if we didn't have these books, these firsthand accounts.
Right, we'd just be left speculating.
Totally.
Like trying to piece together the puzzle with half the pieces missing.
Exactly. And this book, it's like getting a front row seat to how these decisions are made.
Yeah, even if it's just one perspective.
Right. There's always more to the story.
Of course.
But it's still this incredible glimpse into a world that most of us will never see.
Absolutely. And it's not always pretty. Right?
Yeah, not at all.
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen Biden's frustration, his distrust, even moments where he just seems kind of bewildered.
Yeah, like he's trying to figure these guys out.
Right. Like, how do you even deal with someone like that?
Exactly. And I think that's what makes it so human.
Right. These are still just people.
With their own flaws and insecurities.
Trying to navigate this incredibly complex world.
And making decisions that have huge consequences for all of us.
So where does this all leave us?
Well, I think the big takeaway here is that even at the highest levels of government, with all the diplomats and the protocols...
It still comes down to people.
It does. These are relationships just like any other.
It's built on trust or sometimes a lack of it.
Right. And those dynamics can have a huge impact on the decisions that are made.
It's kind of humbling, isn't it?
It is.
Realizing how much goes on behind the scenes that we may never fully understand.
It's like looking at an iceberg.
You only see the tip.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be critical thinkers.
To question what we read and hear.
And to seek out different perspectives.
Because there's always more to the story.
Absolutely.
Well, on that note, I think we've done our due diligence for today.
Yeah, this has been quite the deep dive.
If you're listening and you want to learn more, I highly recommend checking out The War by Bob Woodward.
It's a fascinating read.
It'll definitely give you something to think about.
And as always, there's much more to explore.
Until next time, everyone, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening.